Which screen? The middle one?
Oh, do I need to upload them myself?
Who's the moderator?
And I'm very pleased to introduce my international colleagues here for the session on evidence-informed design. First up, we have the presentation from Amanda Barany that she worked on the design-based virtual learning environment for identity. Worked on that with her colleagues, and Mamta Shah. And I think at the moment, current situation, it's easy to forget that at one point we were able to do research in person. So the context of the presentations today, the presenters are in the privileged position of working face-to-face with their team. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to Amanda and we'll take your questions.
Thank you so much. Hi, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Adele, and for moderating the session. Like you said, my name is Amanda Barany. I don't know if you can see the title above my name here, graduate student. I'm actually now a postdoctoral scholar working with Dr. Foster and Dr. Shah in the Games and Learning and Interactive Digital Environments Lab. And yeah, I'm really excited to share this project that we worked on in well, it's been a 5-year NSF career grant awarded to Dr. Foster to study learning as a process of identity exploration in virtual learning environments and play-based learning settings. So I would encourage everyone to check out the video that I recorded, which kind of goes into a little bit more detail of the 3 iterations of this intervention that we designed. And looking at some of the theoretical models that we used to inform the design as well. But I'll give you a brief overview of some of the main points, and then I'd hope to open it up for discussion. So if anyone has any questions, I can share more detail about how we developed these iterations, how they built upon each other, and ultimately how we assessed learning as identity exploration and what we learned about how to do these kinds of interventions. So basically, we think about learning. We want to shift it away from this process as a more static accumulation of foundational knowledge, and we want to focus on learning that is more active and personally driven and personally motivated in relation to the self over time. And so this is what we mean when we talk about learning as identity exploration, designing these virtual environments, and in some cases with supportive augmented in-person curriculum. Sorry, Stefan, did you want to say something?
No, sorry, I just mute myself now.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, so basically we are designing these spaces, both a hybrid of virtual environments and virtual interventions and in-person interventions to encourage students to explore roles. And in the case of this design project, we wanted them to explore the role of an urban scientist and an environmental advocate. So we developed in tandem with the Epistemic Analytics Group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a virtual learning environment that we called Philadelphia Land Science. And that's where we ended up implementing the design of this project, all 3 iterations. We partnered with a local Philadelphia Science Museum that did weekly programming with high school students in the area to encourage them to explore STEM roles. And this was a really awesome way to engage with local students, particularly diverse groups from different parts of the city, and particularly to expose those who might not have opportunities to explore environmental science and urban planning careers otherwise, with the opportunity to do this in an authentic way. And so part of this virtual environment involved them engaging with a real world analogous map of downtown Philadelphia, which we generated that had individual zones that students could then reshape. And you can see here on this picture on the left in this slide, this is the virtual map that they were able to design and modify. And so each of these colors represents a different kind of urban planning zone that is actually applied to real life downtown Philadelphia. And we gave them experience with using learning about the environmental and economic issues in downtown Philadelphia, and then allowed them to modify the downtown area using this urban planning tool to meet the environmental and economic needs of community stakeholders. Yes, it's Philadelphia, sorry. And so that was the virtual piece. But we also had the opportunity to work with these students across all 3 sessions in the museum science classroom. You know, students were encouraged to play and engage meaningfully in these roles. They wore lab coats, and they showed up every week expecting to engage as STEM career advocates. And so we also designed some in-person advocacy and activities for the students to engage with. Things like we had on this picture is an in-person poster board where they could shape the zoning plan, the zoning pieces, however they wanted to meet their own personal needs. And so it allowed for more in-person negotiation, discussion, and actually a debate ended up unfolding at one point about how much commercial should be downtown, how much industrial, how much housing, and what density of housing. And so we noticed that there were these different affordances for the virtual pieces of each of these interventions and the in-person pieces of these interventions. When they were engaging online, they were able to really understand the complexities of how, adding more commercial into their online zoning tools, would influence economic and environmental impacts, versus if they put greenery, especially next to the rivers, how that would influence ultimately how the city responded to these issues that were important to their community. Whereas the in-person perhaps maybe afforded a little less of that engagement with the complexity of the interaction between these different elements, but it allowed them to share their own personal interests, engage with each other, negotiate, debate, and ultimately also follow their individually centered interests and values. So we had students engaging more meaningfully as urban planners in certain ways. While they're engaging authentically in the virtual space, they're asking us practical questions about what it's like to be an urban planner in the real world space. How much do urban planners make? How many years of college do you need to be an urban planner? Can you specialize as an urban planner? And so that allowed us some flexibility. And when we designed the 3 interventions, we definitely included more use of the virtual tool, the virtual environment, in iteration 1. And as we engaged and studied the data that emerged from iteration 1, we realized that we needed some of these more in-class augmentative activities to sort of balance out the experience for learners who either didn't enjoy using virtual spaces as much or who wanted to engage in other ways. And so in session 2, we had more of that balance between the 2. In session 3, we ended up having to, the amount of time we were able to work with students was cut in half. So we only had 4 class periods to work with them. And we found that amount of time was not enough to give them the experience working authentically in in-depth ways with the virtual tool. So in session 3, we ended up moving towards that more interactive piece so that even though they weren't able to engage in some of these more complex features of acting as urban planners, they were able to meaningfully connect with their peers and role play. And ultimately, we found that having aspects of virtual immersion were absolutely key for encouraging identity exploration in a complex and emerging and in-depth way. But also just as important were these in-person augmented activities to sort of supplement the benefits of the virtual space to create a more balanced and engaging experience. So we have more details about the design changes that we made for each of these iterations, how we ultimately assessed their outcomes, and different phases of the 5-year NSF career grant. Happy to discuss in more detail, but I just wanted to take a pause here and perhaps open the floor if there's questions, anything that people wanted to ask about the video that we uploaded, anything like that.
Thanks very much, Amanda. I wanted to congratulate you on a research project across multi-agencies.
Well, thank you.
And the flexibility that you demonstrated in doing so, working with schools and obviously the Science Institute as well. Is there any questions with the video that learned at the end of that? I'm sure we can all benefit from. But has anyone got any questions now? You can either put them in the chat, or if you give me a wave, I'll see who wants to speak up.
I'll open the chat as well.
Lionel, hi, did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if we should discuss this all at the end because of the next paper, but I found it very, very interesting that you called in-person immersion on this second part, because that does match a lot with the concept of immersion that iLRN follows, which is the, as I and Dennis Beck have put forward in our paper this year, we follow the perspective that yes, we must consider the technological immersion, like on the left, but also the engagement immersion on the right, and
absolutely,
possibly a third dimension, as Nielsen and his colleagues pose, which is a narrative immersion. So I was wondering how interesting would be to look again at what's going on here on these 3 sessions, now using the 3 dimensions of immersion framework to analyze it.
I think that's a great idea.
Being technological immersion, engagement immersion, and narrative immersion.
Yeah, like how connected and you know, immersed were they in this story that we ultimately created, that I would imagine draws on features of both the technological environment that we designed and also the in-person activities that we developed to sort of augment that experience.
Exactly, because it would enable us to look at this, saying, okay, what is the level of engagement, and what is the narrative for that engagement on session 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
Looking at all these different varieties, I think it would be quite interesting in terms of how you could link that to your outcomes.
Absolutely. So in one of the other projects that we've been working on, we're working on assessment from the data that we've collected at this point. And something that, so when we assess identity, we look at it across 4 aspects of information in relation to the self. And that's specific to the role that we're encouraging. And that's the learner's knowledge related to environmental science and urban planning specifically, and also the knowledge of how to use it valuably. Then we also look at their interest and valuing, that's kind of their engagement piece, and how they're specifically, like, explicitly affirming that interest and valuing. We also look at their patterns of self-organization and self-control, and this kind of connects to like self-regulation theory, you know, how they're setting goals and working towards achieving those goals, and, you know, self-regulating in the process. And then we finally look at explicitly how are they describing themselves in relation to this role. Do they want to be this? Do they have another career or role in mind? Do they see themselves as embodying certain characteristics, things like that. And so we actually deductively coded each line of each student's data chronologically for the presence of explicit reflection on these features. Obviously, that's a limited perspective, but we wanted to get a sense of, you know, over time, how are they connecting these different elements of self together as their trajectory across the, you know, digital and the in-person augmented reflective activities. And we generated epistemic networks to look at changes in that over time. And we compared sessions 1, 2, and 3. And ultimately, we found in all 3 sections, interestingly enough, we saw a shift towards increasingly explicit affirmations of interest and valuing of either the role itself, like I would like to be an urban planner, which was not all students, but was some. And then we also saw shifts towards an explicit awareness of the relevance of this in their own personal lives, because this was so embedded in a space that they are deeply familiar with in the real world and aligns with their understanding of their city. They were able to see, oh, I could use this to, clean up certain parts of my city, or I'd like to be a construction worker so that I can redesign these areas. And so they were able to understand how it was personally relevant to them in their own specific positionality. And so I think in a way that captures part of that narrative, like in terms of how they're self-reflecting over time. But I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of understanding how each of these design elements came together to form that narrative. But I think it's such a really, it's definitely an area that I think we can connect more strongly to how we designed each of the sessions.
Add that topic or ask a different question? Certainly, I was thinking, Amanda, about byproducts of the experience that the students had, that, as you said, even if they didn't end up wanting to be urban planners, they certainly developed in skills and capabilities, roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately what we found is not all students ended this experience wanting to be urban planners. That was actually one of the bullet points that we listed as one of the findings in our paper, like some key understandings for other educators or people designing these kinds of experiences. Like what could you learn from these design iterations if you wanted to design and implement something yourself? And one of those was that not every student is going to end an experience exploring a role, wanting to be that role. But that's okay. We ultimately feel that identity exploration is a valuable process, and encouraging students to engage in that is valuable in itself, because ultimately as they gain skill in exploring these different roles, they can apply it to whatever roles they find personally valuable or relevant or meaningful moving forward in the future.
Any other questions? David's asking, can you talk about the urban planning XR experience?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to give more detail on it. That was a very broad overview. So we had weekly modules that were synchronous for all of the students across the different weeks, across 9 weeks for the first iteration, 8 weeks for the second iteration. And then in the third iteration, because it was so shortened, we weren't able to leverage the virtual environment in the same way. So we ended up making a lot of analogous in-class engagement activities instead, and including some digital features, but not using the virtual learning environment in the same complex way that we did in the first two. And so in each of those weeks, students would log into this environment, and there were several different features of it. There was this interactive iPlan map where each person could generate a map of the city that had these modifiable digital pieces, and then they could alter what they are zoned for different factors, commercial, housing, whatever, and they could watch the economic and environmental variables that they found valuable or that their stakeholder group found valuable rise and fall. And so that way they could engage with the complexity of urban planning design. They also had a space that was framed as an email thread with the real world regional design associates company that they were role playing as interns for. And so there they would upload their reflections on the process, what they did, how they engaged as urban planners. And they would also link their maps as part of their engagement in these professional roles. We also supplemented that with in-person meetings where the students would sit in groups and talk about how best to address the needs of those stakeholders. Then I think there was several iterations of gaining research experience. So we had, I think in the presentation, I showed one of the brochures that students were able to explore, where they looked up different fictional stakeholders and read about the interests and values of the Philadelphia area. So some wanted more housing, some wanted to save the birds, and these different groups had different economic and environmental variables. And so we had the students assigned in groups of, in 4 groups to different stakeholder groups that had these more environmental or more economic focuses. And we intentionally aligned students based on their responses in our initial interest survey, where they talked about their prior experiences with urban planning and their interest in valuing of the subject and of the role. And so we used that to assign them to stakeholder groups that aligned most closely with their interests. If they affirmed more valuing of environmental issues, they were assigned to the environmental science groups, or if they were more interested in developing the economy or building commercial spaces or industrial spaces, we assigned them to stakeholder groups with that value. And so when they originally designed their maps in this first round, they were meeting the needs of that specific group with those more specific interests. And then students were jigsawed so that there was an expert from each of the original groups coming together, and they had to design a new map to meet the needs of all 4 groups, which is a lot more difficult. But this allowed students to build on each other's strengths based on the prior iteration. And so the ways that they were practicing that was both virtually through the use of the digital tool and through the virtual reflections and the survey responses and the writing, but also in person through connecting with their peers through professional role-playing meetings, or affirming their interest through the final presentation of their ultimate map that they designed. So those are some of the things that we did to allow them to practice some of the competencies of engaging with urban planning. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
I saw a hand. Free to speak up or type it in the chat, whatever you like.
Feel free if you've got anything to add to that, or with.
Oh, sorry, Adele. Sometimes your audio is cutting out a little bit. Mostly we can hear you though.
Oh, okay. Just saying, we've got a few more minutes for you to get your questions in for Amanda. Amanda, I think I was interested in the model that you used in with regards to self. Self.
I'm so sorry, Adele. It's cutting out. I can only hear parts of what you've asked. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I'll write it in the chat too.
Okay. Sorry about that. Something about the model of the self.
Yes, I'm wondering if the virtual learning XR experience accelerates that from digital to desired self.
Accelerates the process of engaging in identity exploration.
Yes. Yeah.
The virtual environment. So the question is, do I think the virtual environment, the virtual features accelerated the process of engaging in identity exploration around urban planning and environmental science roles? So I think the goal when we developed this environment, so there has been a lot of virtual environments that exist in the world that have really incredible affordances for encouraging identity exploration just by the way that they are designed to encourage deeper learning processes, to encourage interest development. And I think so they are incredibly valuable. And the first phase of this NSF Career Award was actually gathering some data with the permission of game designers on 3 exemplary existing virtual environments and assessing their ability to support different features of identity exploration. So we looked at EcoMove. We also looked at the original version of this game that was developed by of this virtual environment that was developed by the Epistemic Analytics Group, which is Lens Science, which is fairly different from what we ended up developing, and then also River City. And so these 3 environments, we assessed them for their capacity to support identity exploration. And we're looking at it, we hope to encourage students to intentionally reflect on all of the features of identity, because we see them as valuable for exploring a role and understanding whether or not you want to pursue it, or which is a process you can apply to any role. And we found that these spaces intrinsically did this in many cases, but they were not designed with the model of identity exploration that we developed in mind, of course. And so when we designed our space, we wanted to make sure that there was opportunities to intentionally reflect on these different aspects of self, on their growing knowledge, on the ways they find this potentially interesting, valuable, or relevant, on the processes by which they're engaging meaningfully in this role, and on how their understanding of them, of their self, of what they want to be in the future, and what characteristics they embody now. We wanted to encourage them to intentionally verbalize or write down those reflections as they emerged. And so I think that in that sense, the act of verbalizing it and engaging with it intentionally, Avi Kaplan writes about this in the importance of identity exploration, is this intentional piece of the process. I think that does accelerate, maybe not for everyone, but in many cases will accelerate the process of change. Because instead of, engaging in these processes, developing knowledge, but not necessarily being specifically aware of it, or if, for example, may not encourage you to, set targeted goals and work towards goals or characteristics you want to achieve, as well as being intentional and directed about that process. And so I think that's what we were thinking about when we were designing the spaces. How do we make this an intentional, a situated in the authentic, urban planning environment space, and targeted and directed towards these specific roles. And so ultimately, yeah, I think that this encouraged students to verbalize explicitly and enact change that might have been done a little bit more quickly or faster than if we had not designed with these features in mind. Does that answer your question?
That's great, Amanda. Yeah, some great terms there: targeted, situated, and intentional. I'm sure that's what makes such a big difference in these projects. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on. So thank you, Amanda. Let's give Amanda a round of applause or a happy emoji in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone attending. Please feel free to email me at amanda.barany@gmail.com. If you have any questions or you want to talk more, I would love to do that. I'll put that in the chat. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Cool. So next up, I'm hoping these slides move on. Okay, seems I just have to do it like a PowerPoint and click the slides. Great. Wonderful, there's so much activity in the chat. Thanks. If you can make sure you're on mute if you're typing away, that'd be great. Next up, I think there's Stefan's here. He's been working on a project, the analysis of haptic feedback and its influences in virtual reality learning environments. Colleagues, Daniel, Irene. So can I hand over to you, Stefan?
Yes, for sure. So yeah, hi everyone, and yeah, welcome everyone to be here. I'm pleased to present our paper about the analysis of haptic feedback in virtual learning environments. So I assume we all can imagine the importance of. Sorry. Is everything fine? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just carry on. I think someone had their mute off, but you can carry on.
Okay, great. Yeah. Anyway, I think we all can agree on that. Essentially, in the beginning, it seems very obvious that haptic feedback should be supporting for virtual learning environments. Even though, well, we found that different studies on that have kind of proven both sides of the coin. So some said yes, some said no. We wanted to bring a little bit more insight on the matter and decided to create a testing environment where we had two groups of user study participants that had essentially a fairly simple task of throwing objects into targets, which made it fairly easy to evaluate like the accuracy of that. And the clue about that was that one of the groups did that actually, as you can see on the slides, with a modified controller of the HTC Vive. And with the help of this controller, they had the connection to the real world. So sorry. So with that connection to the real world, we wanted to provide some kind of mixed reality setting to compare them to the other group that had the same tasks of throwing objects into targets, just in a pure virtual environment. So while we first imagined that the haptic feedback should, we were the opinion that haptic feedback should definitely support the learning effect. But while analyzing the data that we found during the testing of our group of 55 students, we saw that this was not initially true. So in the end, we found that haptic feedback in our testing setup did not increase the learning effect by much, or by anything that goes over the standard deviation. But what we found was that it definitely helps. So it shows significant increase in understanding and learning effect in our setup when users were handling objects that they were familiar with. Like in the picture you see, there is a copper tape coated baseball. Everyone was familiar with the weight and the form of a baseball. So we could show that people that were handling the baseball showed with each of the throws more of an improvement and more of a feeling for the environment than the people that were only using the virtual version of the same. The same we found if there was a drastic change in form or weight. So we also had weight discs that people were moving, and when people were moving from weight discs to the baseball or vice versa, then we also could identify like a higher increase in understanding. What we identified was for sure a flaw in our approach was that users got kind of irritated if the connection did not flawlessly work. So, well, as you can maybe imagine, the makeshift approach that we had did not work as industrial level haptic feedback gloves, for example. But yeah, sometimes there were connection issues, and we identified that in those datasets, the irritation of the user neglected all of the positive effects that they had with the haptic feedback. Yes, that was pretty much the essence of our approach, and I did not prepare on a 10-minute talk, sorry.
Oh, that's fine, Stefan, thank you. Yeah, so you were only brief to give an overview of your project. I thought it was interesting, you talked about with the unusual objects as well. So there's obviously, as you say, the irritation of the connection not being seamless, and that hindered the progress of the research. But also, I think we've all been there. You can give me a wave if you've been there, where you've been doing a project and the novelty of the purpose of it. So I just, see one or two waves. So just interested if you could expand on that a little bit, and if there is an adjustment of time to allow your participants to get used to the kind of unusual objects.
I hope I got everything that you said now, because as it was mentioned before, you were a little bit interrupted while talking. So how the approach was for the virtual reality group? Well, that was pretty much straightforward. Everyone kind of knew immediately what to do, because there were no hindrances or anything. They were free to move the virtual reality environment. So this one was pretty straightforward. But with XR group, So everyone was given some time. So before the actual experiment, they were explained what is going to happen, what they are going to have to do. Most of them were anyway seeing the previous user study participant, what they were doing, so that already gave some insight. But they were also, they had the possibility to play around a little bit, to get familiar with what they were actually doing, to play around with the objects, and yeah, to get used to the environment before doing the actual experiment. What might have been probably a problem that we identified later on was that we only gave them time to get used to the environment with the baseball. As I mentioned, that was the object that they were actually used to, but not with the weight discs. So the weighted discs that you put on the handlebars for training.
Is there anybody else who has any questions about this particular experiment? Working on anything similar? I can see Diane is typing chat. If you want to come off mute, Diane, welcome to contribute that way.
Sure. Do you mind telling us a bit more about what's going on in that photo? And I'm sorry if I missed it. I'm still catching up on some information.
Sure. I assume you mean the right one. The right picture shows essentially the action of our user. So all users were wearing this glove that you see in this picture on the right hand, and we essentially hijacked HTC Vive controller and put some wires in there and connected them with copper tape to our objects that people had to throw in the virtual learning environment. And we just created virtual objects that resembled the actual objects that one of the groups had to handle with. And as you can see there on the index finger and on the thumb, there was also connection tape. And with this, they essentially had a trigger or triggered the trigger of the controller, and which then made the connection in the virtual world possible as well.
Very cool. Thank you.
Diane? Anybody else? Mina's asking. Why not use a commercial glove?
Yes, that's actually a fantastic question. We figured that our approach would be, well, you could say enough for the idea that we had, but in the end, it provided too much interference, as we mentioned in many use cases. So actually, it was also some kind of pre-work for another future work project that we have planned. Unfortunately, due to the current situation, it's a little bit stuck, but as a teaser, yeah, there we are using commercial gloves of the haptics company. And we assume that the results that we get from this second experiment are going to be more distinct.
By distinct, do you mean that the use of the commercial glove would provide more comfort for the user, and so that wouldn't stray your results?
Yes, exactly that's what I wanted to say with that. So that they would not be so much irritated by unusual environment, and there would hopefully not be any connectivity issues or anything like that.
I see.
Janelle is asking, can you explain more gloves are and how they might improve?
Well, the haptics gloves, essentially, they are a glove that is connected to the VR world, and they have some kind of. I'm not entirely sure on the matter, but I think they have some hydraulic system, or not hydraulic. I don't know how exactly the system works, but anyway, they restrain the fingers of the user that you could actually, let's say you have on the example of this picture here that we have, you have a virtual baseball, and if you would grab that baseball, the glove would restrain your fingers exactly around that baseball. So yeah, that's exactly what the glove does. And we plan to use that one on a more detailed task. So our task here in the testing environment here was very, well, let's say, it was not super accurate. You had to just throw, accurate is not the right word. Anyway, you just had to throw an object into a target, which is not a very complex task. Exactly, complex is the word I was looking for. But with the haptics gloves, we promise, we assume that we can do more complex tasks which would include, well, for example, breakable objects you have to assemble. And yeah, we haven't figured out the exact test case yet, but something in that direction we want to do there. And yeah, in the end, it might improve the experience of the user, hopefully, because they will just, we promise, or we think that this should feel like no issue for the user. So there should be no interference in the data that we collect.
Great. I can see Diane's typing away. Do you want to add to what's being said, Diane? So Diane is going to add her thoughts into the chat. Well, feel free to come off mute. Station going. Stefan, I'm just wondering, there's another project coming up. Is it a direct response from this? What would you oh, sorry, it's Kevin. You had your hand up. Did you want to speak?
Sure, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. Stefan, do you want to talk about any challenges, particular challenges with doing a haptics feedback throwing study? Like, was there any particular challenges with doing a study that required users to throw real-world objects compared to maybe a study that would do something similar but without throwing weights around?
Yeah, that's actually fantastic. So, well, one of the challenges for us was there with the actual study that we had to do, because, well, you could maybe imagine that the virtual study was not much of a problem. We could just invite students to the lab and they were asked to do the tasks, and well, that was pretty much it, because it's all virtual. But the problem was with the mixed reality group, because there we were actually, well, our study participants were asked to throw baseballs and weighted discs around, which would have led to broken windows and anything else in the lab. So therefore, we had to move everything out on a sports field. And yeah, that was definitely maybe also one part that contributed to some unusual environment. So in the end, we moved the whole mixed reality experiment out on a sports field where people had enough space to throw things around, yeah, which introduced more complications with electricity and yeah.
Great question. Thanks very much. Gentle Heron, you had your hand up as well. Are you considering comparing your results to research on mental control of artificial limbs?
Thanks for the question. I actually honestly have not thought about that, even though I have participated once in experiments with, well, exactly what you mentioned, control of artificial limbs. I guess it could be a pretty good approach on that, but probably also with more sophisticated hardware.
More questions coming? I was actually going to ask about, you mentioned that a future project, so is it directly related to what you have been doing on this? What would you like to be able to investigate further? Say on that.
So not going to be directly related to that. So, well, more or less. So what we want to do in the next project is kind of connected to existing research and work on, for example, we are kind of going in the direction of there is a lot of going on in teaching surgical skills, for example, where haptic feedback is an essential part of the VR simulation. And as I mentioned earlier, we intend to do some more complex assembly tasks where you have, for example, some of the parts that you were assembled that you would assemble would, for example, have some certain threshold. What we want to show or what we want to explore in there is if you have an actually accurate environment, how their haptic feedback contributes to the learning effect. Of
Great.
actually feeling the objects and the breaking point and everything.
Good. I just like if anyone's had any final questions. We have a little bit more time in the session. What we can do is stay, and if you want to approach do that, or go into one of the blue zones elsewhere. Do that. So thank you very much, Stefan. Let's give Stefan. Great. So we've officially concluded. As I say, should be able to send a personal message to Amanda or Stefan if you want to. I'm sure they'd be happy to hang out for the final time that we have. I really recommend the videos on YouTube, which is under the schedule for this session, and also the papers when they are published now. Lots more information, some really rich content there. Thanks all.
Yep, thanks everyone.